They are First Amendment advocacy groups, the purpose of which is to educate the local community, come up with basically ideas of what needs to be done in your own locality, in your own state, the specific problems of Homeland Security that have to be addressed, develop a statutory plan, and I suppose at some stage, in fact right now I'm drafting a statute for Virginia. People such as myself would become involved in the drafting of statutes. Interact with those state legislators who have some insight and vision in this area. They get the legislation introduced and then enacted. And the big selling point of this kind of organization is twofold. Number one, once you have people organized this way, you can put a great deal of pressure on the state legislature, because you're talking about potentially several thousand people who are out there affirmatively asking for this kind of legislation. And then number two, to make the legislation work will require initially a fairly large contingent of volunteers to step into the breach, as it were, because most people out there will need a fair amount of education before they're ready to take on the duties of a proper constitutional militia. So we're going to have to depend upon volunteers. And once a large segment of the population has been organized this way, there's the ultimate selling point to the legislator. You put this in, you get this passed. It's not pie in the sky. We have 5,000 people in the state of Virginia ready to take on some of these responsibilities and show that this can be done. And once that experiment has been conducted successfully, and I believe it can be, then thousands and thousands of others are going to want to come into this process, because as the crisis develops and they see the serious consequences are impinging on their lives, what will their alternative be, Alex? They'll either do this or they'll be at the mercy of God knows what. Remember that the militia of the several states are constitutional institutions. The Constitution recognizes these things. So there is no superiority of the federal government over the militia of the several states, quite the opposite. The 10th Amendment also, and the Second Amendment quite obviously reinforce that. But right in the body of the Constitution itself, these institutions are recognized as pre-existing the Constitution and as being intended to continue in existence thereafter. Secondly, your point about the concealed carry licenses, I would say as well, and I agree with you, that the concealed carry license, the only one you need is the Second Amendment, but we do have these provisions that have been put in, and as a result of them, a lot of people who would not in the past have been able to use a firearm to protect themselves have been enabled by this legislation. What I do in one of the draft bills that I'm working on is build on that and say, all right, those people who come into the militia structures with concealed carry permits, the ones who have already been gone through the vetting and the FBI check and all the rest of it, so we know that they're not criminals or whatever, those people will be given further authority as some kind of deputy sheriffs or deputy police or what have you, depending on the jurisdiction, so that they will now participate directly in crime control, crime deterrence, crime prevention, crime apprehension. So all of a sudden now, instead of having 50 police in Warren County where I live, or 60 sheriff's deputies, it all of a sudden becomes 2,000 of them. And now we begin to expand not simply the concept that you have a right of self-protection, have a firearm for self-protection,
but
you can expand that right to participation in actual execution of the law. Well, number one, I don't think that is going to be successful. They're not going to be able to put that thing together, or to the extent they put something together, it's not going to be proved to be terribly functional. In terms of the demonization, I always ask somebody who looks sideways when I mention the word militia, I say, well, what other provisions of the Constitution do you disagree with?
Yes.
I don't agree with the word militia. It says necessary to the free state. What kind of a state do you want to live in? You want to live in an unfree state? The Constitution has told. This is a statement of constitutional law. This isn't some kind of hortatory pronouncement. This isn't some kind of an opinion of James Madison. I take most of his opinions to be more or less correct. It's part of the structure of our fundamental law, and it makes a declaration that I think is pretty emphatic. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Just stop right there. If you don't have this structure, the Constitution itself is telling you, you in the long run are not going to live in a free state. Well, what kind of state do you want to live in? We the people, three most important words in the Constitution. If we don't exercise self-governmental authority, then essentially everything is lost. And the only thing I would suggest to people, because I'm trying to get out, as I say, this message on revitalizing what I consider to be one of, if not the most important pillars of our constitutional structure, the militia of the several states, take a look at that book, Constitutional Homeland Security. As I say, it's on Amazon, and I hope, Alex, it'll end up being on one of your websites. Well, that's right. First, they need to get informed. Take a look at the book. Take a look at my columns on News with Views, where I go into this in some detail, tying it into the banking and monetary system. Become informed about these issues. Decide for yourself whether this isn't something that's vitally important to be done. If you agree with me that it is, get a copy of the book, sit down with some of your neighbors over coffee, and begin discussing how you're going to implement a local plan to get those state legislators off the ball and moving in the right direction. Because that's the key. Get control over that local political structure. We can't control the federal government in Washington, D.C. at the present time. That's quite obvious. Our only alternative then is to work at the local level, the state level, and that kind of work will serve us in very good stead if we find the system coming down on our heads through economic breakdown. Open also will be closing. We will run out of time. We cannot sit on our hands indefinitely, because we are the ones that will make it happen or it will not happen. And of course, that's my goal. We don't want to see the situation develop into any kind of violence, rioting, that type of breakdown in social and economic affairs. But the only way to deter that or prevent that from happening is by the American people themselves reasserting control over this system from the grassroots up. That's the way we're going to avoid real chaos in this society. And anyone who thinks that that's not the key to it, I think, is living in a dream world. All history proves that. If the people themselves don't take control of their own government, then they're going to be subject to whatever terrible things others want to foist on them.